There is a particular kind of man who moves through a room without asking anyone to notice him. He finishes the task, closes the laptop, and says nothing about what it cost him to get there. He does not mention the missed sleep, the quiet frustration, or the years spent learning to solve problems alone. If you ask him how he is doing, he will say fine, and he will mean it as a complete sentence, not an invitation to continue. Many people assume this is simply personality, a natural reserve that some men happen to have and others do not. But when this pattern appears consistently across an entire generation of men, personality stops being a sufficient explanation. Something else begins to look like the real cause. This is not shyness in the ordinary sense. Shyness longs to be seen and quietly fears the exposure that comes with it. What many Gen X men display is something different, a kind of trained indifference toward being noticed at all. It is not that attention feels frightening to request. Attention was simply never treated as something worth requesting in the first place. Somewhere early in life, these men learned it was not something reliably given to begin with. Once a person stops expecting a response, they eventually stop sending the signal that used to ask for one. The visible behaviors are easy to list once you begin looking for them carefully. A Gen X man rarely announces an achievement, even one he worked years to reach. He mentions a promotion the way he mentions the weather, briefly, almost as an afterthought, already moving on to whatever comes next. He avoids conflict, not because he lacks strong opinions, but because raising them feels like an unnecessary risk with no guaranteed reward. He prefers solitude, not as an escape from other people, but as a return to a state that has always felt safer than closeness. He rarely asks for help, even when help would obviously make his life easier. Asking implies a need, and admitting a need has never felt like a neutral act to him. He does not perform his emotions for an audience. He processes them privately, often without language, often without fully realizing that language was ever a real option available to him. He fixes things instead of discussing them, quietly repairing a fence or an engine while a harder conversation waits untouched in the background. He answers questions about his health with a shrug. He treats physical pain the same way he treats emotional pain, as something to manage alone until it either resolves itself or becomes impossible to ignore. Other people tend to notice this pattern before he does. A partner notices that celebration in the household always feels a little muted. A colleague notices that praise seems to bounce off him instead of landing. A child notices that their father rarely talks about himself unless he is asked directly, and often not even then. None of these small observations explain much on their own. They simply accumulate slowly and quietly into a question that almost nobody ever asks out loud. Why does he act as though being noticed is something to avoid rather than something to want? The answer begins early, inside the psychological mechanism researchers call attachment. A child forms expectations about the world based on how consistently their emotional signals are answered by the adults around them. When a child cries and is comforted, they learn that expressing need reliably produces connection and relief. When a child expresses need and is instead met with distraction, irritation, or simple unavailability, they learn something entirely different. They learn that the signal itself is inefficient, not shameful, not wrong, simply unlikely to work. The developing brain, which functions largely as a prediction machine, adjusts its long-term strategy accordingly. It gradually stops sending signals that consistently fail to produce a result. This adjustment is not defiance and it is not stubbornness. It is quiet economy, a conservation of effort learned early and carried forward for decades, often without much conscious awareness that it is even happening. For many boys raised across the 1970s and 80s, emotional expression itself became one of these abandoned signals. This adjustment did not happen in isolation, and it did not happen by accident. It happened inside a very specific historical machine that shaped an entire generation at nearly the same time. Gen X men were largely raised by parents who had themselves been shaped by scarcity, by the psychological residue of war, and by economic hardship. Layered on top of that was a cultural insistence that emotional restraint was simply what maturity looked like for a man. Fathers modeled silence as a form of strength, and not silence was rarely questioned by anyone around them. Mothers, often overwhelmed by the demands of running a household with fewer resources than exist today, faced real limits of their own. They could not always offer the sustained emotional attunement that modern parenting now treats as essential. This was rarely deliberate cruelty on the part of these parents. It was, more accurately, a matter of capacity. Parents gave what they had available to give, and what many of them had was less time and less emotional language. They also had less permission from their own upbringing to slow down and genuinely ask a child how he was doing. Layered onto this domestic reality was a broader cultural moment that reinforced the same lesson from every direction. Gen X came of age during a period that openly celebrated toughness as a defining masculine virtue. Emotional openness in boys, meanwhile, was treated as something bordering dangerously close to weakness. Television, mainstream sports culture, and rigid workplace norms of that era all reinforced a single, unmistakable message. A man who needs nothing from others is a man who can always be relied upon in a crisis. A man who openly asks for attention, by contrast, is implicitly a man who cannot fully manage himself under pressure. This message was rarely stated so directly to any individual child, and it did not need to be stated directly at all. It was absorbed the way children absorb almost everything important, not through explicit instruction, but through repeated observation of what behavior got quietly rewarded and what behavior got subtly corrected. A boy who cried was told to toughen up. A boy who stayed quiet through pain was told he was becoming a man. These small corrections, repeated across thousands of ordinary moments, gradually taught an entire generation of boys that visibility itself carried a cost. If these ideas resonate with you, consider subscribing for more thoughtful explorations of psychology and human behavior. Once this adaptation had fully formed, it continued to function, and for a long stretch of life, it genuinely worked well. Emotional self-sufficiency became a legitimately useful survival strategy for these boys as they grew older. A boy who did not depend heavily on others for validation was far less vulnerable to the natural inconsistency of a household that could not always provide it on demand. A young man who did not expect much attention was rarely disappointed by its predictable absence. Hyper-independence, a quiet distrust of open emotional display, and a preference for solitary self-reliance were not personal defects in these men. They were intelligent, adaptive responses to an environment that consistently rewarded self-containment. That environment offered very little practical incentive for vulnerability of any kind. But adaptive strategies formed early in childhood almost never stay confined neatly to childhood itself. They travel forward, largely unexamined, into every major relationship the adult later goes on to form. A man who learned early that expressing need produces little meaningful result will apply that same underlying logic elsewhere without ever consciously deciding to. He carries it into his marriage, his close friendships, and even his relationship with his own children. He will provide for his family consistently and often quite generously, because providing is a familiar form of care that does not require him to ask for anything in return. He will avoid emotional confrontation with the people closest to him, not because the relationship never needs it, but because confrontation was never once modeled to him as something productive. He will struggle silently through professional burnout, through personal disappointment, and eventually through grief. Struggling silently remains the only coping strategy his nervous system was ever truly trained to trust. This entire pattern creates a very particular kind of loneliness, one that is rarely named or discussed openly because it almost never looks like loneliness from the outside. He is physically present, and he consistently shows up when it matters. He is often described warmly by the people around him as dependable, steady, and refreshingly low maintenance. But dependability, when it stems primarily from an inability to ask for anything in return, is simply not the same thing as genuine intimacy. A man can be surrounded daily by people who deeply love him and still feel privately that no one truly knows what is happening beneath the surface. He has spent decades carefully ensuring that nothing inside him becomes visible enough to require any real response from others. The long-term consequences of this pattern extend quietly into how he experiences aging itself. Men who have spent an entire lifetime deliberately avoiding attention often struggle profoundly during retirement, during serious illness, or during the later moments life eventually presents. Eventually, asking for real help is simply no longer optional. The specific skill of requesting support was never actively built because for most of his life, it was never truly needed. Then suddenly it becomes needed constantly, and there is no internal template stored anywhere for how to do this without feeling deep shame. What once reliably protected him as a child now quietly isolates him as an older man. The very strategy that once kept a vulnerable child emotionally safe eventually becomes the exact thing that keeps an aging man unseen by the people around him. He may sit through a difficult diagnosis without telling his closest friends. He may quietly manage a financial setback for months before anyone in his family learns it happened at all. The habit of carrying things alone does not soften with age. If anything, it hardens, becoming so automatic that even the people who love him most stop noticing it as a choice rather than simply who he is. Beneath all of this behavior lies a quieter contradiction, one that rarely surfaces directly in conversation and yet shapes almost everything underneath it. Many Gen X men, if they are honest with themselves, still want deeply to be known by someone. They want their years of effort recognized and their private sacrifices genuinely understood. They want their inner life to matter meaningfully to at least one other person. But wanting this openly and actually asking for it out loud feel like two entirely different acts to these men. Only one of those two acts was ever practiced or rehearsed across an entire lifetime. So the wanting itself simply stays private, sometimes for an entire lifetime, without ever being spoken aloud to anyone. It is expressed only in small, indirect ways instead. A longer hug than usual after a long absence, an unexpected moment of real openness after a few drinks with an old friend, a sentence that almost says something true before quietly retreating back into familiar deflection. The underlying need did not actually disappear when the asking stopped decades earlier. It simply moved underground, and it has been waiting there patiently, largely unacknowledged even by the man himself, sometimes for years and sometimes for entire decades at a time. This particular paradox points towards something considerably larger than one single generation of men. It reveals a genuinely universal truth about how human beings adapt continuously to the specific environments that shape them early in life. Every psychological strategy, no matter how limiting it eventually becomes later on, made complete logical sense at the exact moment it was first constructed. The child who quietly stops asking for attention is not broken in any meaningful sense. He is responding with real logic to the limited information available to him at that particular time in his development. The genuine tragedy here is not that the original adaptation occurred at all. The adaptation was reasonable, even necessary, given the circumstances that produced it. The deeper tragedy is that environments inevitably change over time, while learned psychological strategies often do not change at anywhere near the same pace. A defense mechanism carefully built for one specific childhood tends to outlive the childhood that originally required it. It continues quietly operating for decades after the surrounding world has, in many meaningful ways, become considerably safer to be openly vulnerable within. This is why the pattern feels so familiar even to people who never lived through the specific decades that produced it. Human beings are, in this particular sense, remarkably consistent across the full span of recorded history. Every generation inherits an entire set of survival strategies from the generation that came directly before it. These strategies were originally built in careful response to scarcity, to war, to instability, or simply to emotional unavailability within the home. And every generation in turn passes forward some modified version of that same inheritance to the next one. Sometimes it corrects parts of that inheritance consciously, and sometimes it unconsciously repeats the very same pattern all over again without ever quite realizing it. Gen X men did not personally invent emotional self-containment as a broader human strategy. They simply refined an existing pattern further under a very specific and demanding set of historical pressures unique to their formative years. They then carried that refined version forward, largely unexamined. Examining it openly was never truly part of what strength was supposed to look like for men of their particular era. The silence became inheritance, and the inheritance became identity, and the identity rarely announced itself as something that had been built at all. What remains at the end of this exploration, then, is not really a personal flaw waiting to be corrected through effort or willpower. It is instead a deeply learned pattern waiting patiently to be understood with genuine clarity. A man who never once asks for attention across an entire lifetime is not actually indifferent to being truly seen by others. He has spent decades quietly believing that visibility is not something the surrounding world reliably offers on its own. So he stopped reaching outward for it long before he ever consciously chose to stop reaching at all. A response that once protected a frightened child can remain fully active long after the original danger has completely disappeared from his life. It quietly continues shaping the way he now moves through a world that no longer actually requires the same practiced silence it once demanded so consistently of him.